What's up, my friends, and thanks so much for tuning in. Welcome to this first exciting installment in the AR Guitar YouTube series with your host, that is Alex. Today we're going to be talking about the major scale. What you just saw there was an improvised solo in the key of C major. Not the best in the world, but of course what that was doing was using the major modes all the way up the fretboard, making a solo of that workable. What we're going to be doing today is learn about the core foundations and the musical theory of making a solo of that work seamlessly. Before I begin, of course, if you're new, please consider subscribing to the channel. Please like the video and please leave me your thoughts in the comment section below. But without further ado, what we're going to be doing is looking at my whiteboard here today, talking about the major scale in 6 levels. Now, the first idea of major and minor is the most basic one that everyone will be familiar with ever since they were a child, which is this idea that major is happy, and likewise minor is sad. Now, there will be some times where going from a major key to a minor key will sound saddened. So, for example, if you take C major and C minor in the song Radiohead's Creep, it will sound contextually saddened. But if you take G major and D minor in the Red Hot Chili Peppers song Down in California, it won't sound any more happy or sad going from major or minor. So it is very much a contextual idea of going between major and minor being made happier or sad. Another kind of abstract duality that we can extract from major and minor is that the major is big, and on the other hand, minor is small. Now, in the English language, there are 2 ways that we can use the word big. So number 1, when it comes to something that's big, we can mean popular. And in terms of popular music, 9 times out of 10, it will be in a major key. So when it comes to the Western musical tradition, whether it's rock, pop, country, and so on, you can probably bet your bottom dollar that it will be in a major key, and it'll be quite rare that it won't be. The other way that we can use the word big is to say size. So if it's a big size, it would be more whole rather than small. So when it comes to the difference between major and minor, if we take the 2 scales or even chords, for example, and put them against each other, we will find that there are certain key intervals between the major and minor, where the major has a larger or wholer interval, and on the other hand, the minor has a smaller interval or a flattened interval. We'll talk about that later in this video, but bottom line is, when it comes to major and minor, there is a way in which we can say that the major is the larger of the scales, and likewise the minor is the smaller. So that's another kind of duality that we can draw, other than simply just the happy and sad one. But major and minor are differing in certain ways, but in this video we'll see that they aren't so different after all. Let's move on to level number 2 next. So level number 2. Let's talk about the generic major and generic minor. So in terms of music theory, 9 times out of 10, when people say the word major or minor, and what they're talking about, let's start with major, is specifically the scale adapted from the C natural or the C natural major scale. And likewise with minor, when people use the word minor, they're probably talking about the scale adapted from the A natural or the A natural minor scale. So let's talk about what we mean by C natural and A natural. So a C natural scale, let's look at the keyboard here, is when we take all the natural, or in this case the white keys, and play them in succession in a linear order until we get back to the root note. In this case it's C. So that I've just played there is a C natural scale. And on the other hand, if I were to do the same starting from A, and I pass through all the white or natural keys until I reach the opening note again, I've played a natural scale. Now, specifically, when I play one of the 2 of those, I am inherently playing either a major or a minor scale. So with the C natural scale, when it comes to the specific order of notes involved with making that particular scale happen, I'm specifically, as a matter of coincidence, playing a major scale. So the C natural scale is 2 things. It happens to be a natural scale, which means it's all white or natural notes involved, no black keys. And number 2, it happens, by virtue of its note orders, to be a major scale. So we'll talk about what I mean by that in just a moment. And in terms of the A natural scale here, what I'm doing specifically when I quote the A all the way back to A scale, I just so happen to be playing 2 things. I happen to be playing an all natural, a natural scale. And number 2, I happen to be quoting a note order, which inherently is a minor scale. So this is why we say that these are natural majors or natural minors, because they happen to be both of those things at once. We can also say that they're natural in the sense that they're assumed. So in terms of music theory, like I said, generic major and generic minor, if we're saying A natural or C natural in this case, we're going to be assuming that that is our blueprint for either major or minor. They're natural in the back of our minds. So that's the pretty much the basis for the second level. What we're going to now do is talk about the third, which moves swiftly on from that. So when you're thinking about those specific scales, what do we specifically mean when we say by virtue of their notes? This is what we're going to be talking about in level 3. So major and minor, let's separate this here. So major and minor are a specific series of intervals or note gaps. And when we're speaking about the C natural scale, when it comes to these specific white keys on the keyboard, all of these notes are not the same distances apart. So when it comes to some white keys, we have to go between a black key. So in this case, let's say we're taking our root, which is C, and we have to get to the D. That's our second note in the scale. In order to make that, we have to jump the black key, the C sharp. There are times where that applies, and there are times where that doesn't, like in the case of E and F or B and C, where there is no black key involved. But when we make that jump over a black key, that is called in music theory a whole step or a whole tone. On the guitar though, that is called 2 frets or 2 semitones. So semi meaning half, whole meaning whole, 2 frets, 2 semitones. And if we're taking the distance, let's say between B and C, or any note difference between keys where there's no black key, that is what is called a half step. So the natural scale inherently is a series of whole and half steps in a very specific order. So if I'm talking about a half step difference, let's say between B and C, I'm only on the guitar, for example, going between 1 fret between B and C. So that means there's 1 semitone difference. This is the difference that we're talking about. We've got whole tones, whole steps, and we've got semitones and half steps. They're the same thing. So when it comes to that specific order in the C natural scale, what we're going to now do is count the different leaps that we're going to need to make in order to get to the next note. So we've done the first here. So what that was first was a whole step, if you see it, because it had to go through a black key. There's now 1 more whole step. Now there's a half step. Whole, 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 and finally half. I'll quote that. So that was whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. So what I'm now going to do is count the differences between the notes in the A natural scale, and this inherently will give us a formula for what we mean by minor. So in this case, we've got A, B, C, D, E, F, G, back to A again. We've got whole step, half step, whole, whole, half, whole, and whole. So let's write that down. So that is whole, half, whole, and whole. So exactly what I've just quoted there between major and minor, that specific quotation of note orders or semitonal distinctions, that specifically is what we mean generically by major and minor. So if we're talking about let's say a D major scale, we're not necessarily talking about a D natural scale. What we're going to do is play that specific order of whole and half tones, and we're going to start it in D in that context. The exact same thing can be said about the A natural scale. So if we splice and transmute that specific whole and half step differences in that specific order, what we get is a minor scale, which doesn't need to be specifically in the A natural key. So now that we've talked about that, there's a specific level that we now need to explore in level number 4, which is this idea of relativity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight the start and stops of the A natural and C natural scales to illustrate a few basic points that we can then make some conclusions from. So if I've highlighted the A natural there and the C natural there, what you will see is 2 things. So number 1, I've used the exact same notes, and number 2, we'll need to explain this one in just a moment. What I happen to have done is use the exact same order of whole or half steps. And what I'm going to need to do is draw out once again the semitonal distinctions between major and minor one by one. So let's start with major. Start over here, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 and half. And over here, let's do the same thing for minor. So we've got whole, half, whole, whole, half, whole, whole. So what I'm going to do is highlight the C and the A in both of these scales. That's the C and that's the A in the major. And this one is the A in the minor, and that one's the C in the minor as well. So let's say, for argument's sake, I were to start on the second from last interval in the C major scale. What I have to do then is take that particular starting point, bracket it off, and I have to treat the end of the scale as basically a continuum or the beginning of a cycle. So that then starts again from the beginning of that same scale, and it terminates from that next in line from the beginning, or the contrived beginning in that case. So once again, we're talking about a C major scale, and what we've just done there is make a new scale with these specific whole and half steps. Whole, half, so once again, whole, whole, half, whole, and whole. And what we've therefore just done is quote the A natural scale, or the minor scale, completely from the same exact order, from the end, from the C major scale. So what that must mean, therefore, is because we've got a linear order of natural notes between both the A and the C natural scales, it means that the specific order of semitones is exactly the same with both scales, major or minor, just happens to be the natural scales in this case. So this therefore must mean that both scales are inherently related. This is why we've got the idea of relativity as level 4. So when I say relativity and related scales, not only are they natural scales, the natural minor and the natural major in this case, but therefore any major and therefore any minor scale, whether it's natural or not, is inherently related by its semitonal genetics. Because if one starts that specific cycle of whole and half steps on one interval and the other one starts on another kind of interval, they will still, however, be quoting the exact same order of whole and half steps. It makes them related to each other. So this means that when it comes to a major scale, it will always have what's called a relative minor. So in terms of, let's say, the guitar, let's say I wanted to play an E major scale. So what I'm doing is drawing my major bar chord over here on the 12th fret, which happens to be E. If I wanted to play the relative minor chords from that particular major scale, what I have to do is derive the note difference between the C interval and the A from the same natural scale. And it's the exact same in both, whether it's major or minor. Let's just take minor in this case. The difference between this interval and that interval inherently is 1.5 steps or 3 semitones. Because of course you have to times it by 2, anything that's half. Therefore, to transmute that logic to the fretboard over here, what I have to do is go backwards by 3 semitones to arrive at a relative minor, as it's called. So I've just drawn a minor bar chord. So if I went from the 12th fret, the major chord, over here to the minor chord on the 9th fret, I would be playing the relative minor chord of the major scale that I've just played. What I'm actually doing under the hood is playing the exact same notes. So really all those chords are doing is playing a selection of the scales. Let's say in terms of the major scale, I'm taking some aspects of the scale and putting it onto a chord. But in terms of minor, the exact same thing is happening. So what happens therefore between the major and the minor, if they're relative, they are actually overlapping in terms of their note choices. So it's not just the natural scales that do that. And we've illustrated that between A and C. In this case, it's E major and C sharp minor on the fretboard over there. It means that major and minor must relate, and they must share both the same, not only the same whole and half steps between the two of them, but they also must share the same notes in both of their chords and scales. So this means, like Yngwie Malmsteen will say,
minor and a major is the same thing. A minor and C major is the same thing.
So there is some truth in this sort of abstraction between the two. They're not the same thing. They are very different scales, but they are quoting the same genetic makeup, let's say. So they're relative in a wider family. We'll get onto that later on in this video. But there's two parts of this idea of relativity. What we now have to do is explore the wider relativity. So we've just said that the A natural scale and the C natural scale, because they overlap not only in terms of their notes and their semitonal changes, what we have to also understand now is that there's not only an A natural scale and a C natural scale, which are related, but necessarily it means that there's a B natural scale, a D, E, F, and G natural scale as well that we've not explored. So if we're saying that the A natural and C natural are both related in terms of their notes and their semitonal distinctions, it must therefore mean that every single natural note on the piano must therefore be a kind of related scale, whether it's major or minor. So therefore what we've got to do is axe the idea of the generic major and the generic minor and come to a more unified idea of major and minor. So what I'm going to do is draw out a few scales over here. Let's start with C and we start with A because we've just done that. It's going to be quite easy. So the C natural scale, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 and half. So that's the major. And in a C context, it happens to be natural major. But there's a specific label for that order of tones and halftones, and it's called Ionian. So when we're talking about a generic major scale, specifically under the hood, what we've actually been doing and quoting musically is an Ionian mode of the major scale, which happens to be the generic major scale that most people will be talking about. And likewise over here, the A natural scale, which happens to be this order of whole and halves. And what we're talking about there, when it comes to a minor scale, not in a key of A, happens to be an Aeolian mode of the major scale. So once again, we're going away from this idea of major and minor as being these generic ideas, what people are mostly referring to in 9 times out of 10. When we're talking about major and minor in music theory, what technically we're doing at all times when it comes to either a major or a minor scale is quoting a mode. And it just so happens that these particular two modes are mostly what we're talking about when we're talking about major and minor. They are the natural major and the natural minor in so many ways, but unfortunately this means that we're not actually talking about every single major and minor scale, because these other natural scales in most cases happen to be quoting from different kinds of major and minor scales that aren't generic, not based on the C natural or the A natural in these cases. So what we're going to do in this next part of our 4th level of relativity is talk about those other kind of natural scales and what they mean for our theory of major or minor. So let's start with D. Let's start with the D natural scale. And what we can do to find the next order of semitonal differences is we can get rid of the first step from our last mode, which was the Ionian mode, and put it on the end of that scale, and that would be the new natural scale. In this case, it's D. So let's now quote that. So we've taken away that first one, so it's whole, half, whole, 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 half, whole. And to prove that that's true, let's replicate that on the keyboard. So once again, whole, half, whole, 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 half, and whole again. And that is exactly what I just quoted. So that specific order of whole and half steps, although it's referring to the note order of the D natural scale, what it actually is a Dorian mode of the major scale. And unlike the Ionian mode of the major scale, this happens to be another minor scale joining the Aeolian mode over here. But let's keep on going. Let's make a quick work of this. So the E natural scale, once again we're using that trick from before, so that's half, whole, 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 half, whole, whole. What we're doing is quoting out a Phrygian mode of the major scale, and that also happens to be minor.
A minor is the same as E Phrygian.
And we've got 3 more scales here to explore. I'll try my best to make this quick. So the F natural scale, what we're doing is quoting whole, 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 half, whole, whole, half. And that specifically is a Lydian mode. And this happens also, like Ionian, to be a major scale. So there's the second of a possible 3 major scales, one of which being the natural, one of which being the generic. Next we've got the G natural scale, and that specifically is whole, whole, half, whole, whole, half, whole. And that is specifically a Mixolydian mode. And that happens also to be major. So one way of remembering whether it's major or minor with both the Lydian and Mixolydian is because it's got the word Lydian somewhere in it, whether it's right at the front or it's somewhere at the back, you can remember that they are related tonally. So they are both major, they happen to be non-generic. And then finally we've got the last natural scale and the last mode of the major scale. This one is neither major nor minor, and this one happens to be what's called a diminished scale. And let's quote the order of whole and halves. And this one is called the Locrian mode. But now I've talked about relativity in our 4th level of this video. Now I'm going to talk about the 5th level. And what I'm going to do is expand upon this idea of relativity with the analogy of the universe. This might seem a bit strange, but this is the best way in which I can explain away the relationship between all the major and the minor modes and the diminished modes. So let's, in this case, think of all of our modes as planets. So this is an Ionian planet, this is a Mixolydian, and this is a Lydian. And these planets, these modes, are in a solar system, and it's the major solar system in this case. And likewise, we've got a minor solar system next door. So we've got the Aeolian mode, so that's the natural minor. We've got the Dorian, so that's the natural D scale derivative. And then we've got the Phrygian, which is the natural E derivative. Oh, one I forgot, we've also got the Locrian, don't we? That's diminished. So they both happen to be existing in their different solar systems, but they both exist, these ones, in a galaxy of natural scales. So in this particular galaxy of 3 solar systems, there are necessarily 7 planets, because that's 1 times 7. 1 mode times by how many of them there are. So that's 7. So that's 7 natural scales, and that's a separate galaxy. But now let's talk about this other neighbouring galaxy. So this is the non-natural scales. If you can kind of already see what I'm trying to do is a Venn diagram. It's not going very well, but just bear with me. So this is the non-natural scales galaxy. And it's the exact same thing as before. We've got a major solar system of Ionian, Locrian, and Mixolydian. We've got a minor solar system of Phrygian, Aeolian, and Dorian. And finally, we've got 1 lonely planet in 1 lonely solar system, the Locrian. What I'm not going to do is draw however many planets there actually are in these solar systems, but think of it like this. We've got something times 7, because there are 7 modes. There are 11 times 7. It is 11 times 7 in this case, because there are 12 semitones in the musical scale, or in the chromatic scale, and we're taking away 1, because for every single scale, we're going to take away the natural in terms of the modes. So if we've got 12 semitones, let's say the Ionian, so we've got 12 Ionian scales, we've only got one natural, which happens to be the C natural scale. So that means 12 take away 1 for every 7 of those modes. So that means we've got 77 planets, or 77 non-natural scales in this case. And this is the big lesson in level number 5 now. Both of these galaxies exist in a wider universe in this Venn diagram, which I'm now going to try my best to draw. So both of those galaxies are in a universe, and this universe happens to be called the diatonic scales. And what that is 7 plus 77, which is 84. So there are 84 diatonic scales. So what I mean by diatonic scales is any major, minor, or diminished, or half diminished in this case, scale based on the modes that we've just talked about. And there are 2 particular characteristics in any kind of diatonic scale, which is number 1, 7 notes, so it must be heptatonic, and number 2, it must be 5 whole steps and 2 non-repeated half steps. So any kind of scale, whether it's natural or non-natural, or if it's Ionian or Aeolian, Phrygian, and so on, provided it conforms to that order of semitonal distinctions and happens to be 7 notes long, that will mean that any scale that we're talking about, they're in a wider family of musical scales called the diatonic scales. The word diatonic comes from the Greek meaning dia, meaning through, and tonic meaning tonic, of course. So that means a scale that goes through to the tonic. So a natural scale, as an example, it takes the a natural root and it goes all the way to the tonic. To be a little bit more helpful, although this isn't the actual meaning of the word diatonic, you can kind of think of the word diatonic to mean di, meaning 2, like dioxide, and tonic meaning tones. You can think of, therefore, the diatonic scales as being a scale based on 2 kinds of semitonal distinctions, both whole and half. So a diatonic scale has both whole and halves. It happens to have 5 of one and 2 of the other, 2 non-repeating of the other, I should say. But any diatonic scale must be 7 notes, and therefore it encompasses every single one of those modal scales that we've talked about, whether it's non-natural or natural, and so on. So there are 84 of those. So now that we've discussed exactly what major and minor are and what it all encompasses, we've got one more level, which happens to be quite a simple and easy one. And I've also got for you is a easy way of remembering the mode names, because that's going to be very important for later. So in our 6th and final level in this video, what we're going to do is understand how and why a major diatonic scale, or a minor diatonic scale, or likewise a diminished, is what it is. So we're going to understand why we're calling a mode a major mode. What we're going to do is divide this page into major and minor, and we'll have one over here for diminished. I hope that's going to be enough room. So there are 3 modes of the major family. So as you remember, that'll be in our major solar system. And likewise, we've got 3 minor modes of our minor solar system, and then finally we've got 1 diminished scale. So let's talk about it. So what I'm going to need to do in order to start understanding whether a mode is major or minor, what I need to do over here is actually give ourselves a reference point in order to understand whether something's major or minor. In order to understand whether something is major or minor, we need a Ionian or generic major reference point. And what I'm also going to need to do is number these notes. Critically, what I need to do as well is introduce this idea of intervals. So in music theory, all the interval means is note number in a scale. So if we've got a diatonic scale, like the Ionian scale, what that means is there are 7 notes followed by 1 tonic, which is simply just the repeating of the root. So we've got 8 intervals, or what we sometimes call degrees. And what this is over here, what we just quoted here on the fretboard, is our reference for all of our understanding of major and minor, because by changing an interval from its Ionian starting point, we're inherently making it some kind of major scale or some kind of minor scale, or indeed some sort of diminished or half diminished mode from the diatonic family. Let's start off by doing one important thing, which is to recognize that the Ionian scale and the Aeolian scale are both in the middle of their respective major or minor solar system. And what we mean by that is they are sort of in the middle of darkness or brightness in whether they're major or minor. And of course, by brightness and darkness, what I mean is kind of happy and sad, like I said in the first level of this video. So the Ionian scale isn't actually the happiest or brightest scale type. So what we'll now do is talk about what the first scale type is in order of brightness. So the very brightest mode out of the 7 and the brightest out of the 3 major is the Lydian mode. And what we've got to do to the normal Ionian scale over there on the top is we've got to take that 4th note or the 4th interval and we have to actually sharpen it by 1 semitone. So what we'll do is we'll put an arrow so it's being moved and we'll put in the sharp symbol above it. So we'll just say the Lydian mode is just like the Ionian mode with a sharp 4 or sharp 4th interval. So the flavour that's evoked from that sharpened 4th interval is a sort of unnatural, even a sort of eerie brightness. You can kind of say that that's sort of a mythical or an angelic kind of happiness, sort of a concerned sort of happiness. Some songs that use the Lydian mode include songs like Dream Theater's Another Day, airy, blissful, sort of sunset-like quality. And this is what Dream Theater do well, they stir up a lot of emotions from their music. But yeah, that's the Lydian scale. It's sort of an unnatural brightness, and that's why we're putting it at number 1. What we're going to say now for the Ionian at number 2 is just to say reference, because that's what it is. It's unchanged. But we do need to go back 1 when it comes to our intervals. So number 3, we've got the Mixolydian major mode. And what we're doing to it is changing the Ionian scale by 1 more scale degree. So we're not sharpening the 4th in this case. What we're doing for the first time is actually darkening or flattening an interval. And we are flattening the 7th interval in this case by 1. So just going to put an arrow here. And we're going to put in the flattened symbol, the little B. And that goes flat by 1 semitone. It's now moved over here to the 10th fret. Now, the mixed Lydian mode is potentially my favourite mode of all of the mode types in the diatonic scale because there are so many different kinds of flavours and so many different kinds of tones that you can evoke. You can get something that sounds vaguely menacing, you can get something that sounds quite naughty but nice maybe. Because it's bright yet dark, it's sort of not quite getting dark enough to be minor, but it's dark enough to evoke some sort of scheming sort of cool factor, you can say. You can get a sort of exotic kind of flavour, you can get a mysterious flavour, you can get kind of a psychedelic flavour, you can get bluesy and jazzy sort of feelings. Some examples of the Mixolydian flavour used, once again include Dream Theater songs. You've got Metropolis Part 1, but yeah, I've talked enough about the mixed Lydian scale. I could probably talk about that one all day. Next, we're going to talk about our first minor scale. What I think I'll say before I even talk about the minor scale is the one thing that unifies all those major modes in the major scale family is the idea of the major third. So the third interval being unchanged is critical. So you have any kind of major triad of notes, which means there's a chord with 3 notes inside of it. All of those modes will have a major third interval retained. And that particular interval is a extremely relaxed, extremely melodic sort of sound. And this is why most doorbells that you'll be hearing out there in the world will be pitched to a major third against its root. This is why most children are greeting each other in the pitch of a major third against the root, to a major tonality even amongst their language. That's how important the major phrasings are. And now what we're going to do is contrast that with the minor modes. All minor modes of the diatonic scales are not using a major third, and they're actually going to be using what's called a flattened third or a minor third interval. So this one over here with our first mode, which is the Dorian mode, which is the brightest out of all of the minor modes. So what we're going to do is take away that third over there, which is currently a major mode, and we're going to now flatten that by 1 semitone, and we're going to pop that onto the 13th fret. So just like the Mixolydian mode, the Dorian mode is somewhat major and somewhat minor, but it's an importantly minor enough mode to be a minor scale because it's got a flattened third degree. So we've not only flattened the 7th interval, just like the Mixolydian for the Dorian mode, we're flattening the 7th and the 3rd. So it's that characteristic flattened third that emphasizes a sort of glum melancholy compared to the Mixolydian cool factor. So when we're thinking of a Dorian minor scale, what's normally evoked is a sort of sincerity, solemnness, you could say, almost heroic at times, not necessarily purely sadness. So this is why the Halo theme is quoting a Dorian note variety. It's quoting a some parts major mode and some parts minor mode, enough to evoke certain feelings within both of those modes. Not necessarily just purely glum, but it can be expressive. So it's expressively sad, but not so sad that it'll make you seriously sad. But let's talk about the second darkest minor mode now, which is the generic, the Aeolian, which comes from the A natural. So once again, we've got the flattened 7th, we've taken the flattened third from the Dorian. And what we're now doing, unique to the Aeolian, in this case anyway, is we're now flattening the 6th degree. So let's take away that 6 from our fretboard. Let's give it a new home. Now, when it comes to most songs in an Aeolian mode, in whatever key, provided that they are really emphasizing that 6th degree that's flattened against a possible Ionian reference, that is where they really start to get a sort of a sad tone. Some examples of that would be Megadeth's The Tu L'Amore, for example. There are plenty of songs out there. That's one of my favorite minor songs. It's distinctively melancholic in tone. It's not just simply the scale it uses, it's also the lyrics, it's sort of its ornamentation, it's sort of its rhythm as well. But it's that flattened 6th degree that really does make it quite sad. Street Spirit by Radiohead does the exact same thing, I think. But to talk about the songs that I talked about in the first level, so let's say Red Hot Chili Peppers uses the A minor scale in Danny California. It's not really emphasizing that 6th flattened degree, and this is why we don't really hear so much of a glumness in its tonality. It's also the ornamentation and rhythm of the song, but really when it comes to the Alien scale contrasted at least by the Dorian mode, you are inspiring the listener to feel a certain kind of melancholy that's not really so present in Dorian or even Mixolydian. Let's move on to the third and final minor mode, which is, if you remember, the Phrygian mode. So just like the Aeolian, we have all those characteristics. We've got a flat 7th, flat 3rd, flat 6th, of course against the Ionian reference. In this case, we've got a flattened 2nd interval. That particular flattened 2nd interval, that sort of semitonal difference between two intervals in this case, is distinctly menacing and distinctly threatening in its vibe and in its aura. And this is why theme songs like the Jaws theme song are using a distinctly Phrygian mode, because it's that sort of tonal gap that's just one space away that makes you feel like something's edging towards you. It feels like a monster's drawing near. So it's not simply a sadness, but it's also a kind of danger to be aware of. And now finally we've got the diminished mode. So once again, we flatten the 7th, we flatten the 3rd, we flatten the 6th, we flatten the 2nd, and in this case, which makes it the distinctly diminished or half diminished scale, the Locrian scale, we're flattening the 5th interval. It's that one over there in the middle. We actually now need to pop it over here. There we go. So the diminished scale is called diminished because the flattened 5th interval against the other intervals in the scale is inherently dissonant, really urging a kind of resolution that it's not quite getting. And this is why the diminished scale sounds quite chaotic. With Phrygian sounding quite dangerous, diminished sounds chaotic, almost frightening, so it's more dissonant and it's more clashing intervallically. What I'll say as well for both diminished and the other ones, the major and the minor, in terms of a major, minor, or diminished triad, very quickly what I'll do to make things a little bit clearer. So just like the beginning of this video, I was saying that the Radiohead song created a sort of eerie, minor, saddened atmosphere. What it was doing was taking a major triad and it turned it into a minor triad. In terms of a major triad, it's taking its 1st interval, its 3rd interval, and 5th interval, and with the minor variation of it, it is taking all of those intervals, but it is flattening its 3rd interval. And that's where the minor characteristic of the Radiohead song gets its energy, from its specifically flattened 3rd interval. And in terms of the intervals that are being flattened, what the diminished or half diminished scale is doing in this case is pretty much doing what the minor scale is doing. So it's at its 3rd interval flattened, but what also it's done, if you remember over here, over on the right, it's got its 5th interval flattened. So it's the flattened 3rd and 5th specifically that will give it a sort of dissonant, diminished flavour. It's so darkened that it's actually quite unstable. What I'm going to do very quickly, and I'll be very quick with this, I will finish off this video, so I'm not going to talk about any more layers. What I'm now going to do is give you some easy ways of remembering the modes, the 7 modes, because that's going to be useful for the video to come. So what I'm going to do is very quickly list off all the modes. We've got the Ionian mode, we've got the Dorian mode, we've got the Phrygian mode, we've got the Lydian mode, we've got Mixolydian mode, we've got the Aeolian mode, the natural minor mode, and then finally we've got Locrian over here. What we're going to do, I'm going to grab a different colour for this, is we're going to take every initial of all of those modes and we're going to use that to create an abbreviation. So we've got I, D, P, L, M, A, and finally L. And we're going to spell out a sentence with it. So once again, we're going to start with I. We're going to say a sentence. We're going to say I, D is don't, P is particularly, L is like, M is modes, A is a, and finally L is lot. And that spells out the sentence. I don't particularly like modes a lot. You may have heard of that way of remembering the modes before. That's the one that I would say is pretty useful. It's not going to tell you whether it's major or minor, but it will at least allow you to remember the mode names. If you just think of, I don't particularly like modes a lot, you think of every single starting letter, and you'll eventually be able to sort of ingrain it in the back of your head. So one more slide that I'll include here is just one way of remembering if it's major or minor. Let's say you've just remembered all of the mode names, but you can't quite remember if they're minor or major, or diminished in this case. What I do, and this is my way of remembering that, is what I do is I draw the major minor burger I've not heard of this method before. Correct me if you've heard it, but I've not so far done so. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a burger, and it's got 2 patties inside it. So this burger must rely on the idea of symmetry. Starting off with the Ionian at the very top, every patty is a double helping of either major or minor, and it happens to be the other way around in here. So if we've started with our bun being major, it has to be a double helping of minor. It has to be minor, minor. And if you remember the idea of symmetry, if I've just done minor, minor, the next patty must be major, major. And then finally, to complete the symmetry of the buns, if I've started up the top with a major bun, I must have a minor bun to end with. And one more thing about this burger, it's sitting on a dinner plate. And that dinner plate is not the burger, so it's not major or minor. And this is why I'm going to label that dinner plate diminished. So the word dinner plate, or words dinner plate, starts with a D. You can kind of remember that as being reminiscent of the word diminished. So now that we've got that order of major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, diminished, what we can now draw on using those abbreviations. Here's our burger one more time. So I've got 1, double, double, 1. So Ionian, that's I. Minor, minor, which is Dorian and Phrygian, and that's our don't particularly section of that sentence. And then I've got major, major next, which happens to be Lydian and Mixolydian. Another way of remembering that they're both major is if they've got the word Lydian inside of them. And then finally, the next burger. And then finally, we've got the L in Elot, and that happens to be Locrian. I don't know if you can see that. So there we go. So you've got your major, minor burger. But that concludes the video. So that wasn't necessarily another level, but that's just a nice little way of remembering both the order of the modes and how to know if they're major or minor, each of them, or diminished. So I'm going to leave the video here. I'm going to thank you very much for getting to the end of the video. I really do hope that's been somewhat educational and somewhat entertaining. I really do hope that I see you in the next video. I'm going to do another video in the weeks to come, and that will be talking about the modes on the guitar. So what we're going to be doing is how to use the theory that's been talked about in the 6 levels here, and we're going to put that into action, and we're going to be using a specific system that I like to call the Euler system, and that'll be very useful in terms of ingraining that theory of those modes into your fretboard knowledge. But yeah, enough of me today. Peace and love to all of you. I'll see you in the next installment of the AR Guitar YouTube series. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.